I think the story that's being told to you by the media today is not true. Okay, the story that's being told to you by the media today is basically Jeff Flake, intrepid Trump fighter, struck down in the prime of his young career because he stood up against the nastiest man in the universe, Donald Trump. Breitbart and Trump stand ascendant over the prone Flake's body as Flake speaks the truth to power. That's the story that you're getting, and you're getting it from all sides. You're getting it from Flake's camp, you're getting it from the Breitbart Trump people, and you're getting it from the media. And I have to say, I don't think this story is even close to the full story. So first, let me express what I think the interests are for everyone in doing what happened yesterday. So to move back a little bit, Jeff Flake yesterday, the senator from Arizona, announced he would not run for re-election, and then he gave a long speech just ripping into President Trump, as well as Republicans who were basically soft pedaling President Trump for a long time. Now, to Flake's to Flake's credit in terms of consistency, Flake did not endorse President Trump during the last election cycle and was very critical of President Trump. So I'm not saying that his opposition to President Trump is insincere. I think it is sincere. But I think the problem for Jeff Flake is that he knew that he was going down, and so for the past few months, he has basically attempted to carve out a position as the anti-Trump guy, right? The guy who's going to earn strange new respect from the left for saying things about Trump. Now, I want to be fair here. I've said a lot of the same things about President Trump Jeff Flake says about President Trump. I agree with a lot of what Jeff Flake says about President Trump. But the difference is that I also compliment Trump when I think he does something right, and I also acknowledge that people voted for Trump not because they embrace Trumpism, not because they think that Trumpism should replace conservatism, but because Trump was the only tool on hand at the time. Remember, Trump won a historic low percentage of votes in the Republican primaries to win the actual primaries. Okay, so it's not like he was well-loved inside the Republican Party. Once he was nominated, then the Republican Party swung behind him because he was the nominee against the most hated Democrat of my lifetime, Hillary Clinton. But that is not the same thing that Jeff Flake is saying. What Jeff Flake basically said in this speech is the Republican Party is a bunch of deplorables, right? I mean, he basically made the Hillary Clinton contention. The Republican Party is a bunch of deplorables who have fallen into league with Satan. Now, again, I think a lot of his critiques of Trump are true. And I think that people, I've been saying for a long time, people need to be intellectually honest about what Trump is and what Trump isn't, and they ought to call out lies and untruths and half-truths when they see them. They ought to call out the vulgarities and the stupidities that emanate from the White House. But that's not the same thing as saying that all Republicans are incapable of doing this. And this seemed to be Flake's contention. Flake was basically saying in this speech, listen, the reason I'm going down is not because of me. It's not even because of Trump. It's because the Republican Party has fallen into disrepair, that Republican constituents, my base, the people who elected me, are a bunch of dunderheads. It's not that they made a choice against Hillary Clinton. It's not that they held their nose and voted for Trump. It's not even that they like Trump, but they can also critique him. It's that they have fallen full scale into under the sway of President Trump. I think this is a wild overstatement. I also think it's a politically convenient one. So let's play Flake's speech, and then I'm going to explain what I think is really going on. So Flake gets up yesterday on the floor of the Senate, and he says that he is not going to run for re-election. He explains why.
Sustained incumbency is certainly not the point of seeking office, and there are times when we must risk our careers in favor of our principles. Now is such a time.
Okay, so he says that now is the time for all men of goodwill to stand up, except that he's resigning, right? He's not sticking around to fight Trump's bad agenda items. He's not sticking around to run for re-election and try and, wrest control of the party away from Trump. No, Jeff Flake is resigning. So where exactly is where is he risking his career in favor of principles? Where was the risk? Like, this is the part that I don't really buy. Okay, the idea that he risked his career to stop President Trump. Jeff Flake has been the most unpopular senator in the United States Senate since 2013. Okay, so long before Trump was running for president, long before anyone cared about Steve Bannon, long before anyone cared about Breitbart. Okay, the fact is that Jeff Flake was a very unpopular senator pretty much from the get-go. There's an article in The Atlantic in 2013 that was titled, How Jeff Flake Became the Most Unpopular Senator in the United States, right? 4 years ago, before Trump was a gleam in the media's eye or Bannon's eye, and Bannon wasn't a gleam in the media's eye, right? The fact is that Jeff Flake was already unpopular. And the reason that Jeff Flake was unpopular is because he was a hard-right congressman who won 75% of the vote in his district for several terms running. And then he came to the Senate and he decided to move to the center. The American Conservative Union points out, as Senator Flake's score is 80% over 4 years. As representative, his score was 98% over 10 years. It's a 20% drop-off in the ACU score. And it's not just that. Here's a list of some of his votes. Jason Johnson, who's a former Ted Cruz chief staffer, he laid out a bunch of the votes here. He suggested that well, here's what he says. It's tempting to comment on Flake's floor speech, instead offering context on his view of governing by highlighting a few of his votes. Jeff Flake was one of 10 Republican senators who voted to confirm Loretta Lynch for Attorney General. Flake voted to fund President Obama's unconstitutional executive amnesty. Flake voted against Senator Mike Lee's First Amendment Defense Act. Flake voted for President Obama's $1.1 trillion Cromnibus 2015 spending bill. Flake voted for S-2114, which increased Russia's power at the IMF. Flake voted for a clean debt limit suspension. Flake was one of only 11 Republican senators who voted to confirm Janet Yellen. Flake voted for the Ryan Murray budget, which lifted spending caps and raised taxes in exchanges for promises of future spending cuts. Flake voted for the Gang of Eight amnesty bill. Flake voted for the post-Newtown gun grab. Flake voted against the Defund Obamacare Act of 2013. Flake voted to increase debt by $900 billion in exchange for the promise of discretionary cuts in the future in 2011. Flake preferred John Kasich over Cruz or Trump in the 2016 GOP primary. Okay, so the point here is that Jeff Flake used to be a much more conservative guy, and he moved to the center, and as he did, he lost the support of the people of Arizona. Right? He looked disingenuous, and so he lost that support. So here he is saying that he's going down on the burning pyre of Trump, that he's falling on his sword, that he's basically the monk in Vietnam setting himself on fire to demonstrate to the entire world just how terrible President Trump is, but that's not really accurate. Jeff Flake was going to be primaried. He was going to run a very tight primary no matter what. Now, his opposition to President Trump hasn't helped him for sure. But again, I think that it's less about his opposition to President Trump and more about his opposition to the people who voted for President Trump. And this is a distinction worthy of note. Okay, you can oppose things that Trump does. You can even say, I don't think Trump makes a very good president. You can do all of those things. But what you can't do, and what he hasn't done, Jeff Flake has not voted against Trump's agenda items. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, Jeff Flake has voted with President Trump's agenda items. So when he says that he doesn't like Trump, it's really more a matter of what Trump says and what Trump does as president, not a matter of policy. So how that materializes is, you can say, I think Trump is vulgarizing the discourse. I think President Trump would be better off if he stopped doing this stuff. I think President Trump is not a very good president because he's not doing these things. But that's not what Flake does. Instead, Flake seems to go at his own constituents, and he has been since April, basically saying the Republican Party was subject to a takeover by a bunch of dolts and morons. And I don't think that that's particularly smart politics, nor do I think it's true. I really don't think that's true. I think there are a bunch of people who voted for President Trump in the primaries who just thought he was the angriest guy on the stage and didn't think beyond that, which I do think is not smart. And then I think once we got past that, there were a lot of people who voted for Ted Cruz in the primaries, or voted for John Kasich in the primaries, who also voted for Donald Trump for president to stop Hillary Clinton. So Flake continues along these lines, and he decides that he is going to be the one who stands up to President Trump. Again, I think some of this is Flake posturing. The reason that I brought up his popularity ratings and his record is to demonstrate, I think that the real story here for Flake is this. Flake does have sincere opposition to President Trump. He does not like President Trump. He thinks President Trump is a boor and a vulgarian. I think some of those critiques are fair. I really do. But what's really happening here is that Flake was going to lose his primary anyway, and now he sees the opportunity to go out as the tragic hero who sacrificed himself in order to throw himself on the gears of the tank to stop President Trump, instead of just another senator who wasn't particularly popular in his home state and feels certain things about Trump. So now he has an interest in basically blaming Trump for his ouster. Now, Trump and Breitbart have an interest in taking credit for his ouster, because they can say, listen, we run the movement now. If you cross Trump, we will toss you overboard. Right? If you cross Trump, if you cross Breitbart, we will toss you. Again, Kelly Ward's been running for Senate for well over a year. Breitbart's only gotten involved at the very tail end, and Bannon's only getting involved now. The same thing is true of Roy Moore in Alabama. Bannon and Breitbart basically backed the guy who finished third, Mo Brooks, in the primary, until they switched to Roy Moore, and then they take credit. I think Jonah Goldberg has a good line about this. Bannon and Breitbart have a bad habit when it comes to these races of being the rainmaker who waits for it to, the first rule of rainmaking, as Jonah says, is wait for it to start raining and then start dancing, right? Because then people mistake the dancing for the cause of the rain. And I think that that's exactly what's happened here. So Breitbart and Trump have an interest in saying, we run the party now, cross us, and we'll burn you down. I don't think that's actually real. I don't think that's actually true. I think that you can cross Trump pretty much with impunity, actually, as long as you don't say that people who voted for him were wrong to do so, or not understandable, it was foolish and ridiculous for them to do so, or they're racist, sexist, bigot, homophobes who sign off on everything Trump does because they voted for him. That's lefty talk, and it's not accurate either. So the Trump and Bannon, I don't think, are telling the truth. I don't think Flake is telling the full truth. And I think the media have an interest in this narrative, too, because it does a couple of things for them. One, it allows them to create this perception that Trump is the evil manipulator behind the scenes, the Palpatine behind the scenes, making sure people like Bob Corker and Jeff Flake, the true heroes, are put to the boot. And I don't think that's interest number one. And interest number two is they like portraying the Republican Party as split, and so anything they can do to exacerbate that split, they will do. So here's Jeff Flake going after President Trump directly.
Mr. President, I rise today to say enough. We must dedicate ourselves to making sure that the anomalous never becomes the normal. With respect and humility, I must say that we have fooled ourselves for long enough that a pivot to governing is right around the corner. A return to civility and stability right behind it. We know better than that. By now, we all know better than that.
Okay, so there he is. We all know better. Nothing good is coming around the corner. Again, all of this is fair, but I don't know why it's effective or useful. Like, I think that we all have our feelings about President Trump. I've been highly critical of President Trump, but I do not know what the purpose of all this is. And then, and here's where he casts himself in the role of martyr. Here's where he does the Joan of Arc routine. He's going to hop up on that pyre and light the flame. He says that, this is not about political savvy. This is about principle. It's about principle. Well, if it were really about principle, you'd stick around and run for re-election and see if you can convince the Republican Party to agree with your principles. He's bowing out because he knows he's going to lose. Here he is.
Now, I'm aware that more politically savvy people than I will caution against such talk. I'm aware that there's a segment of my party that believes that anything short of complete and unquestioning loyalty to a president who belongs to my party is unacceptable and suspect.
Okay, so that last line, that my party believes anything short of complete and unquestioning loyalty to a president who belongs to my party is unacceptable and suspect. I think it's a pretty small segment of the party. I really do. I think the Bill Mitchells of the party, the people who think that Trump cannot be criticized under any circumstances, I don't think that's right. I just don't think that's true. I think there have been a number of senators who have criticized Trump, including Rand Paul, by the way, who's going to win his re-election easily. Yeah, you can criticize Trump so long as it doesn't feel like you're ripping his voters for voting for him. Again, he continues along these lines, and the martyr routine is a little bit strong here. He talks about how principled he is even more.
If I have been critical, it is not because I relish criticizing the behavior of the President of the United States. If I have been critical, it is because I believe it is my obligation to do so, and as a matter and duty of conscience. The notion that one should stay silent and as the norms and values that keep America strong are undermined, and as the alliances and agreements that ensure the stability of the entire world are routinely threatened by the level of thought that goes into 140 characters. The notion that we should say or do nothing in the face of such mercurial behavior is ahistoric, and I believe profoundly misguided. Again,
the idea that people aren't saying anything against Trump is just absurd. Everyone's saying things against Trump. Now, listen, I think some people have been cowards in this situation. I don't want to pretend that everyone has been, paragons of virtue here. I think Paul Ryan doing I've never seen his tweets routine. I think that Mitch McConnell doing I'm just going to ignore whatever the president says routine. I think that's wrong. I think that they should speak out. But again, I don't think speaking out is the same thing as saying that you're going to go down simply because you spoke out. I don't think that's correct. The reason I'm objecting so strenuously to this is because I know enough conservatives to know that we are a good-hearted party still that is attempting to do the right things. And I think that criticism of President Trump, so long as it's not taken as criticism of his voting base, I think that people are willing to go along with it. I think that what Jeff Flake is doing, and this is really what I object to, I feel like what Jeff Flake is doing here is he is surrendering the party to Trump and to Bannon and to and to the media's perception of what the Republican Party is, solely so that he can look as though he's a martyr to this new Republican Party, so that he can play Saint Thomas Becket and against Henry II. Like Henry II. I don't see the purpose of handing over the party. I don't think this is true. I don't think that you have to hand over the party to everything Trump says, and drawing this false dichotomy, which is really what Flake is doing here, between the Bill Mitchell wing of the party and the true speaking wing of the party, and you have to pick one of those two. I don't think that's right. I think that you don't have to agree with Jeff Flake on everything in order to criticize President Trump, nor do you have to say that everyone who voted for President Trump is going along with every element of his agenda in order to say that those people were voting for some. Listen, I disagreed with that vote, right? I didn't vote for anyone at the top of the ticket, but at least I understood why the vote was happening. And I'm not going to attribute bad motivations to the people who disagreed with me on that vote. I mean, that's silly, and that's what I feel like Flake is doing. And I've got to say, it feels like some of this is for posturing and personal gain, considering he came out with a book called Conscience of a Conservative 4 months ago, and then did the rounds talking about how bad Trump was in the middle of a tough primary fight. If you want to win a primary, you don't go out there and then suggest that the party that embraced President Trump is a nasty, terrible party. What you can do instead is you can say they were misinformed, which I think is true, that they were lied to, which I think is true, that there were people who were preying on a justified anger, which I think is true. But this is the equivalent of, this really is the equivalent of, remember when Hillary was asked whether she blamed women who didn't show up to vote for her? And she said, yes, of course I blame them. It feels like some of this. So it's convenient for Jeff Flake to do that while he's stepping down. Again, this is not even me disagreeing with Flake's critique of President Trump. I don't think President Trump has been a very good president. I think he's actually been very negative for conservatives in a number of ways. That doesn't mean he's been that across the board. I mean, as I've said, Gorsuch, regulatory cuts, right? All these things are good. But